Hello, dear listener, and welcome to our tale of Salem. Tonight, we will journey together through the shadows and whispers of a village long ago. Before we begin, if you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves quiet, haunting tales, and subscribe so you never miss another whisper in the night. Now let us enter Salem, where the winds of history and fear still linger. The year was 1992. The winds of January carried with them more than snow. They carried whispers. Whispers that slid like shadows between the wooden homes of Salem Village, catching on shutters, curling beneath doors, pressing against the ears of those who lay awake at night. The moon was pale that winter, hanging over Massachusetts Bay like a lantern left too long in the cold. Its light fell on fields where the stalks of last year's harvest still jutted from the frozen earth, brittle as old bones. The ground was hard, unforgiving, and the people who worked it were just as rigid, just as enduring. But beneath their prayers and their sermons, beneath the stern rhythm of their daily lives, something unsettled stirred. Dot imagined the hush of a snow-covered night, the crackle of a single candle on a wooden table, the sound of wind pressing itself against thin walls, the warmth of breath turning the mist inside a cold room. This was Salem Village, a place both real and dreamlike, where faith ran deep and fear ran deeper. The minister of the village, Reverend Samuel Parris, sat by his hearth on such a night. Flames licked the logs, their light casting restless shadows along the room. His daughter Betty, only 9 years old, lay wrapped in blankets nearby, restless in her sleep. At his side was his niece, Abigail Williams, a girl of 11, sharp-eyed and curious. These children did not know that their lives, and the lives of all around them, were about to shift into something no one could contain. The world they inhabited was small, a cluster of homes, a meeting house, a church, and fields that stretched into the wilderness. Yet soon their small world would become a stage upon which terror, rumor, and justice would twist into one. The fire in Reverend Parris's hearth burned steadily, yet the chill of suspicion had already begun to seep in. The girls whispered of strange sights, of shapes seen at the corner of vision, of dreams that felt too real. Their words were small sparks, tossed into a dry forest. And the forest was waiting. The winter wore on. Snow gave way to thaw, and thaw gave way to mud. But the whispers did not melt with the snow. They grew louder. They grew heavier. Betty fell into fits that frightened her father, her body trembling, her voice catching on cries no one understood. Abigail joined her, shrieking at shadows that no one else could see. The village took notice. At first, neighbors whispered explanations in hushed tones. Childish mischief, perhaps sickness. But as the girls' fits grew stranger, the village remembered stories. Stories of Satan's hand, stories of witches who walked in human form. In Massachusetts, faith and fear were not far apart. A strange cry in the night could be a fox or a curse. A stumble in the field could be a clumsy step or a hex, and so the villagers gathered. They crowded into the parsonage, peering at the trembling child, watching Abigail's eyes roll back as though she beheld some unseen world. They prayed over her. They pressed Reverend Parris with questions. And when no answers came, suspicion filled the silence. Now imagine the wooden floors beneath their boots, creaking with every step. The thick smell of smoke from tallow candles. The cold pressing through even as the room filled with bodies. Their breaths rose in small white clouds, each mingling with the others until the air itself felt heavy with unease. It was then that names began to rise. First, spoken carefully, uncertainly, then more firmly. Tituba, the enslaved woman in Reverend Paris's household, was among the first. She was different, her skin, her accent, her songs unfamiliar. Difference was dangerous in Salem. Accusations, once whispered, became threads that wound around Tituba's life, pulling tighter with each passing day, and she was not alone. Other names soon followed, each carried by the tremor of fear, each spoken as though naming might bring safety. But naming only fed the fire. The meeting house filled with talk of witches. Men struck the table with their hands, demanding action. Women clutched their children closer, eyes darting at neighbors who now seemed strange, even threatening. The Mara. Snow had melted, but the cold remained, and with it, suspicion that froze even the warmest of friendships. And so began the fire, a fire that would consume not wood, but trust. Not houses, but loves. The court would soon be called the Oyer, and Terminer, a name that rolled like thunder, promising judgment. Before it could rise, though, Salem had to pass through the first sparks. The girls would scream, they would writhe, and they would point their trembling fingers at those they feared, or those they despised, or perhaps simply those they saw. And now, as you drift in thought, let the candlelight flicker in your mind. See the shadows that danced on the walls of Salem homes. Hear the low hum of voices in the night. Voices carrying rumor like embers in the wind. Something unseen was moving through the village. Something that turned every creak of the floor into a question. Every rustle of the wind into a warning. This was the beginning. The fire had awakened, and would not sleep again, not until it had claimed the voices of 20 souls. The days grew longer, though in Salem it seemed that the sun had lost some of its warmth. The village carried a hush, a waiting stillness, as though the earth itself held its breath. Neighbors watched one another more closely now. Conversations ended abruptly when certain footsteps approached. A glance that once meant friendship might now carry suspicion. Within the parsonage, Reverend Paris's worry deepened. He saw his daughter Betty pale and weak, saw his niece Abigail with eyes that darted restlessly as though searching the corners of the room for invisible figures. He prayed, yet the prayers seemed swallowed by silence. His sermons spoke of sin, of God's watchful eye, of the dangers that lurked when faith faltered. But his words, meant to comfort, often only stirred. The unease further died, and still the girls cried out. Their fits came like storms, sudden and fierce. At times, they collapsed to the floor, their limbs rigid. At others, they shrieked with such force that even the stoutest men shuddered. They claimed to see shapes, dark forms that pressed against them, hands unseen that pinched and pulled. The villagers could not look away. They whispered, then argued, then decided. This was no ordinary illness. These were afflictions of witchcraft, thought one evening. As the fire dimmed in the hearth and the air grew thick with smoke, a meeting was held in the home of Reverend Paris. Men of standing gathered, their boots leaving mud across the floorboards, their cloaks heavy with the damp of thawing snow. Samuel Parris's voice shook as he told them of Betty's torment, and Abigail, with eyes wide and voice trembling, confirmed it. The room felt close, every word clinging to the walls. They spoke of Tituba, of her strange tales told by the fire, of her songs that carried rhythms foreign to Salem ears. Suspicion thickened like smoke. It did not take long before her name was fixed, carried forward as the first accused. Imagine, if you will, the silence of that moment. The hush as one name, spoken aloud, seemed to shift the air itself. It was as though the village had taken its first step down a path from which there would be no return. Soon, more names followed. Sarah Good, a woman poor and often wandering, whose mutterings and ragged clothing had long mocked her as an outsider. Sarah Osborne, who had quarreled with neighbors and strayed from the path of proper worship. Each woman, in her own way, was vulnerable, set apart from the rest. And in Salem, to be apart was to be at risk. The chill of fear spread quickly. The meeting house became crowded with villagers, eager to hear the latest accusations. Men stood, with folded arms, their brows heavy with suspicion. Women clutched their shawls tight, eyes wide as they listened. Children huddled near, their ears filled with stories of dark powers that moved unseen. When the afflicted girls were brought forth, their cries filled the room. They pointed, their voices shrill, and the accused stood trembling before the crowd. To deny was to invite louder cries. To resist was to see the girls collapse in fits more violent still. It seemed that every word spoken against an accused woman gave the girls new strength, as if fear itself fed their torment. In the flickering candlelight, the trials began not in courtrooms, but in whispers and gatherings, in prayers spoken louder than before, in eyes that darted toward neighbors once trusted. The village of Salem was no longer a place of quiet worship and steady toil. It had become a stage, and every man, woman, and child had a role to play. Outside, the snow melted into mud. The river swelled with thaw, carrying with it the fragments of winter. Yet inside Salem, the frost held fast. Suspicion clung to the air, as sharp as ice. Every knock at the door carried dread. Every shadow that passed the window seemed a warning. And yet, for all the fear, there was also a strange sense of purpose. The villagers believed themselves chosen, set upon by the forces of darkness because of their purity, their devotion. To fight the witches among them was to defend God's will. And so the hunt was not only allowed, it was sanctified. Tituba was brought before them. Her dark eyes flickered in the dim light, her voice trembling as questions pressed upon her. Did she consort with the devil? Did she send her spirit to torment the children? Did she ride upon beasts in the night? The questions came sharp and endless. At first, she denied, but the pressure bore down upon her, the weight of many voices demanding confession. The girls screamed, their bodies twisting, their fingers pointing at her. Fear settled upon her shoulders like a heavy cloak. At last, words spilled from her lips, words of confession, of stories that mingled truth with terror. She spoke of a black dog, of a red cat, of specters that came to her in the night. She told of a tall man who promised power, of figures who signed a book with blood. Whether these words were born of desperation or imagination, the villagers heard only confirmation. To them, the devil was no longer a distant threat. He was here, in Salem. And with Tituba's confession, the fire leapt higher. If she had seen others, if she had named companions, then there were more witches still hiding. Each word she spoke became another thread, binding more names, drawing more neighbors into suspicion. The village, once bound by shared toil and prayer, was now bound by fear. Every step on the wooden floor of the meeting house echoed like a drumbeat of doom. Every candle flicker seemed to reveal another face that might be guilty. And yet, in the quiet of the night, when the fires dimmed and the village hushed, there were those who wondered, could it truly be so? Could friends and neighbors, those who had shared bread and labor, truly serve the devil? But such thoughts were dangerous, and most pressed them down, burying doubt beneath layers of prayer. The moon passed slowly across the spring sky. Buds appeared on trees, and the fields prepared for planting. Life moved forward, yet Salem was caught in a storm that no season could soften. The whispers had become voices. The voices had become cries, and the cries demanded judgment. The court would be called. The Oyer and Terminer, a court unlike any Salem had known, would soon gather to pass its sentences. And as its shadow lengthened across the village, the people could feel the weight of its presence. The fire had grown too fierce to contain. And so, as you drift deeper into this tale, picture the wooden benches of the meeting house, worn smooth by years of use. Picture the flicker of candlelight dancing across anxious faces. Hear the rustle of cloaks, the sharp intake of breath as another name is spoken. Each moment drew Salem closer to the day when words would no longer be enough, when lives themselves would be demanded. The fire was awake, and it was hungry. The month of March crept over Salem, though it came not with soft breezes, but with a gathering heaviness. Clouds pressed low, their shadows stretching across the bare branches of the trees. The earth, damp with thaw, gave off the scent of wet soil, a reminder that life should be beginning again. But within Salem village, the new season brought not renewal, but reckoning. The afflicted girls, Betty, Abigail, and others who had joined them, no longer needed prompting to collapse into fits. It came upon them as if on cue, writhing on the floorboards, screaming of shapes and spirits that clawed at them. Their voices pierced the quiet village, and their bodies, twisting and trembling, convinced many that no ordinary mischief was at work. Neighbors gathered in hushed groups. Some shook their heads, muttering prayers. Others leaned closer, eager to hear each new detail, each whispered accusation. The story spread like a fog, drifting from house to house, seeping beneath doors and curling into every conversation. Soon, all of Salem was speaking not of planting or trade, but of witches by candlelight. Families whispered to one another, fearful that even walls might listen. The sound of the wind through the trees could make a woman clutch her child closer. A knock at the door might quicken the heartbeat, for who knew what news, what suspicion, might stand waiting on the other side. The first examinations began. They were not yet trials, not yet the solemn proceedings of a court, but gatherings in which the accused stood before neighbors and ministers alike. The room was thick with breath and smoke as the accused were questioned, their every word measured. Their every gesture watched Sarah. Good was among them, her hair tangled, her clothing ragged. Poverty had long marked her, and poverty in Salem carried its own stain of suspicion. When asked if she was a witch, she denied it, her voice shaking. Yet her denials only stirred the girls into greater fits, as though her words themselves carried a curse. They clutched their throats, gasped for air, and cried that her specter tormented them, even as she stood before the room. To some, it was proof enough that Sarah Osborne, weak with illness, was carried into the meeting house. Her frailty, once reason for pity, became instead a mark of guilt. Why had she not attended church as she should? Why had she quarreled over land and inheritance? Questions bore down upon her like stones, and though her answers faltered, they did not sway the crowd. Suspicion had already taken root. Tituba's confession hung heavy over every gathering. Her words of devils and strange creatures lingered in the air, repeated in whispers until they seemed no longer her own, but truths that belonged to Salem itself. When the girls shrieked and pointed, many saw only the echo of Tituba's tales, proof that the devil's book had been signed, that more names would yet be revealed. The examinations grew more crowded with each passing day. Villagers pressed against the walls, their faces pale in the flickering light, eager for every word. Ministers leaned forward, brows furrowed, as they sought signs of sin, of deceit, of the devil's touch. The accused wept, pleaded, and swore their innocence. Yet innocence was a fragile defense in Salem, easily broken by a child's cry or a sudden fit. Outside, the air smelled of thawing earth, of smoke from chimney fires, of damp wool cloaks hung to dry. Horses stamped their hooves at the meeting-house posts, their breath rising in pale clouds. The world moved as it always had, yet within Salem, time itself seemed to shift. Every day brought new accusations, new confessions, and new fear. In April, the prison in Ipswich grew crowded, its stone walls holding those accused of witchcraft. The cells were damp and dark, straw spread thin across the floor. The air was heavy with the scent of sweat, of mildew, of despair. Chains clinked as prisoners shifted, waiting for a fate none could yet name. Back in Salem, the afflicted girls seemed to grow in power. Where once they had been children, now their voices commanded the attention of ministers and magistrates. Their cries could bring a neighbor to ruin. Their words could bind a man in chains. Some whispered that the girls were guided by more than fear, that they carried with them a strange authority, a shadowed strength. Yet to question them was to risk suspicion oneself. And so the village bent beneath the weight of their words. The meeting house became a place of spectacle. Neighbors craned their necks to see each new examination. Gasps filled the air when the girls collapsed, when they cried that they were bitten, pinched, clawed by invisible hands. Ministers spoke with solemn tones, urging the people to see the devil's work for what it was. To doubt was dangerous. To believe was safety. And still, the names multiplied. What began with a few women grew into many. The circle of suspicion widened until no one could feel secure. A sharp word spoken in anger, a quarrel over land, a glance held too long. All might be remembered, repeated, twisted into proof. Night fell over Salem with a silence that was never still. Dogs barked in the distance, their voices carrying on the wind. Owls called from the woods, their cries strange and haunting. And within the homes of Salem, candles burned low as families prayed with whispers, asking that the shadow of accusation might pass them by. The land itself seemed to mirror the fear. The forest beyond the village stood tall and dark, their branches creaking in the night. The river, swollen with meltwater, murmured as it moved, carrying secrets with its current. The sky stretched wide above, yet the stars seemed faint, as though even they dimmed at the weight of Salem's fear. By May, the need for a court could no longer be denied. The prison swelled with the accused, their numbers too great, and their fates too uncertain. The colony called forth a special court, the court of Oyer and Terminer, to hear and determine. It would be held in Salem, its judges men of stature and authority. Their task was clear: to bring justice, to reveal the truth, to cleanse the village of witchcraft. Yet justice in Salem had already bent beneath the weight of fear. As the court's arrival drew near, the village held its breath. Once more, horses carried riders along the dirt roads, their hooves striking with a rhythm that seemed to echo in every chest. The meeting house doors creaked open and shut as ministers prepared, their sermons sharpening into warnings of sin and salvation. And, in the still of night, the afflicted girls lay in their beds, their eyes wide in the darkness. Dreams came to them, or visions, or perhaps only shadows of their own making. Yet when morning came, their cries would fill the air again, carrying with them the power to shape the fate of Salem. The fire, once a whisper, now burned with open flame. And as you drift deeper into this story, imagine the faces of Salem lit by candlelight. Imagine the sound of boots on wooden floors, of voices rising in accusation, of sobs echoing in the still air. Picture the fields waiting for planting, the forest standing silent, the river carrying secrets. Salem was alive with fear, and fear was alive with Salem. The court was coming, and with it, the first true blaze of the fire. The spring sun climbed higher, yet its warmth did not reach the hearts of Salem. For even as buds unfolded on the trees and the river ran full with snowmelt, the air was heavy with dread. Children played less in the fields, their laughter hushed. Men spoke in lower tones at the edge of the village green. Women's hands trembled as they kneaded bread, as though every sound outside their doors might carry news of another arrest. The prison now held many. Chains rattled as men and women were led through the streets, their eyes lowered and their faces pale. Some wept openly, while others walked stiff with defiance, their voices rising above the murmurs of the crowd to swear their innocence. Yet innocence was a fragile shield in Salem. Once suspicion had taken root, no words could easily pull it free. The court of Oyer and Terminer gathered in June. Its judges were men of power, respected across the colony. They sat with grave expressions, their robes heavy upon their shoulders, their eyes sharp. The meeting house filled beyond its walls, neighbors pressing close, the air thick with heat and the mingled scent of sweat, tallow, and earth carried in from outside. The first to stand trial was Bridget Bishop. She had lived long in Salem, a woman with a spirit not easily tamed. She wore bright clothing, unlike the somber dress of others, and she spoke her mind too freely. These things had long marked her as different, and in Salem, difference was dangerous. The afflicted girls screamed when she entered, their bodies convulsing, their voices piercing the air. They cried that her specter tormented them, that she sent shadows to choke and pinch. Bridget denied it. Her words were firm, her eyes steady. Yet as she spoke, the girls collapsed again, writhing upon the floor. Their cries drowning her voice. The judges watched, their brows heavy. Ministers leaned forward, their hands pressed tight. The crowd gasped, their whispers swirling like wind through the rafters. Bridget's protests seemed small against the tide of fear that filled the room. Witnesses spoke of her stubbornness, of quarrels, of strange events linked to her. Each word stacked upon the next, building a wall she could not climb. When the verdict came, it was death. Bridget Bishop was condemned to hang. The gallows stood in Salem, a wooden frame stark against the summer sky. The crowd gathered, the heat pressing down upon their shoulders, the air heavy with silence. Bridget was led forward, her hands bound, her steps measured. She lifted her chin, her eyes scanning the faces before her. Some turned away, unable to meet her gaze. Others stared with a mixture of fear and certainty, as though to look away might invite suspicion upon themselves. The rope swung gently in. The breeze. The sound of wood creaked as the platform bore its weight. A prayer was spoken, low and solemn. And then the silence broke with the fall of the body. Bridget Bishop was the first to die, but not the last. The people of Salem returned to their homes that day with a heaviness they could not shake. Some wept quietly, though not in the open. Others spoke in firm voices, saying justice had been served, that God's will had been done. Yet beneath their words lay a trembling unease. For if Bridget Bishop, a woman known to them all, could be condemned as a witch, who among them was safe? The trials pressed on. June faded into July, July into August, and with each month the number of accused grew. The afflicted girls cried out with renewed force, their visions sharper and their screams louder. Men and women who had once stood shoulder to shoulder in labor now faced one another across the courtroom, one weeping in chains, the other swearing testimony against them died in the still of the night, when the stars burned faint above the village. Those accused lay in prison, their minds restless with prayer, with fear, with the memory of the rope's creak in the summer wind. Mothers thought of their children. Husbands thought of wives. Wives thought of husbands. And all wondered if their names would soon be called, if their steps would soon be led to the gallows. The gallows themselves became a shadow over Salem. Even when empty, its wooden beams seemed to loom in every thought, a silent reminder of what awaited those condemned. The fields were planted, the harvest growing. Yet even in labor the people felt the weight of its presence. Each stalk of corn, each grain of wheat seemed touched by the shadow of death dot, and yet the court did not falter. The judges spoke with authority, their voices carrying the conviction that Salem must be cleansed, that the devil's hand must be cut from the colony. Ministers preached sermons of vigilance, of righteousness, of the narrow path of salvation. Each word pressed the people deeper into fear, deeper into certainty. Neighbors who once broke bread together now eyed one another with suspicion. A door that once opened in welcome now closed more quickly. A silence stretched between friends, thick and heavy, for any word might be twisted, and any doubt might be noted. And in Salem, doubt itself was dangerous thought by midsummer. The gallows had claimed. More lives. Men as well as women, young and old, stood upon the platform, their voices raised in prayer or protest. The crowd watched, their faces pale in the sun, their hands trembling in the still air. Some believed, with burning fervor, that they witnessed God's justice. Others, though silent, felt the creeping chill of doubt. The fire burned on. It spread beyond Salem village, touching towns nearby, drawing in more names, more accusations. Letters were written, warnings sent, the story of Salem's trials reaching ears far beyond its fields. Yet for those within the village, the world seemed to have narrowed. Each day a step along a path carved by fear dot as August drew near. The air thickened with heat, the fields heavy with grain. The river ran slower, its waters warm to the touch. Yet within Salem, the storm had not eased. The afflicted girls still cried, their voices shrill, their bodies shaking with unseen torments. The court still sat, its judges solemn, its verdict sharp, and the gallows stood waiting, its shadow long upon the ground. And as you drift in thought, picture the wooden beams of the meeting house, the hushed crowd pressing close, the flicker of candlelight on pale faces. Hear the creak of rope, the murmur of prayer, the sharp cry that cuts through silence. Salem's fire burned bright, and though the sun shone on fields of gold, the village knew only the color of fear. The fire was not only awake, it was roaring to soften as the first breaths of spring pushed gently through the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Yet, though the frost loosened its grip upon the earth, a deeper, sharper chill clung to the hearts of those who called Salem home. It was no longer the cold of winter, but the unease of whispers, words carried from lips to ear, from neighbor to neighbor, like unseen smoke drifting through every chamber and every street. Inside the parsonage, Reverend Samuel Parris walked with restless steps. His candlelight bent long shadows against the wooden beams of his home. Each flicker seemed to twist and move like a spirit trying to escape. His daughter Betty lay still, and his niece Abigail sat quietly, her eyes wide, her face pale as though she held within her the memory of a thing she could not speak. The silence between their breaths was louder than any scream. At first, some had believed it was only illness, a fever of the body. But when the girls shook, when their cries pierced the still night, when their limbs bent and their voices whispered names of people they should not know, fear spread like fire across. Drywood. Salem was no longer a town at rest. Mothers began to clutch their children tighter at night. Fathers stood longer at the edge of fields, their gaze drawn toward the dark line of trees that loomed at the boundary. Lanterns were lit earlier, doors barred sooner. And still, the sense of being watched, of being judged by some invisible presence, grew stronger with each passing day. And so, when the meeting house doors creaked open, and the voices of the afflicted spoke of shapes in the dark, of figures that bent over their beds at night, of hands that pressed upon their throats, the people listened. They did not dismiss. They did not soothe. They believed. Belief has a power greater than sight. It does not require proof, only a willing heart and a fearful mind. And Salem was filled with both. Reverend Paris, his voice sharp with both authority and trembling conviction, declared that Satan was among them. His words rang through the wooden rafters, bouncing, echoing, and embedding themselves into the ears of every man and woman present. The devil, he said, sought to destroy Salem, to unravel God's chosen people. And in that moment, it no longer mattered if the whispers were born of truth or imagination. They were real, because fear had made them real. A name was spoken, Tituba, the enslaved woman who had told stories in the firelight, stories that curled like smoke around the minds of the young. A woman who did not look like them, who did not belong to their circle, who stood always at the edges. The first spark caught fire when her name was lifted into the air, and the people leaned forward, listening, trembling, and agreeing. The town began to change. The creak of wagon wheels over frozen earth seemed louder. The strike of hammer against nail carried an echo of unease. Even the crowing of roosters at dawn seemed like an omen, warning of things to come. Salem was awake, but it was not the gentle awakening of spring. It was the awakening of fire. And now, as the nights grew longer with worry, and the days filled with suspicion, the people began to look not at the woods beyond their fences, but at one another. Eyes lingered too long. Words carried sharper edges. Trust, once the very thread that bound the town together, began to fray. And yet, this was only the beginning. The fire had only just been lit. The church bell of Salem, small and humble though it was, began to toll against the evening sky. Its echoes rolled across the frozen fields, over the roofs where smoke curled in tired wisps, over the bare trees where crows perched like black shadows. Each strike of the bell seemed slower than the last, as though time itself was thickened by the frost and by fear. Inside the homes, shutters closed quickly. Candles flickered in narrow windows. Families gathered close to their hearths, speaking in low voices that were half prayer, half whisper, as though afraid that even their walls had ears. And perhaps they did, for in Salem, by 1692, the air itself felt heavy with secrets. Children clung to their mothers' skirts. Fathers frowned and stirred their fires with unnecessary force. For in the meeting house, the ministers had spoken of strange happenings, and the rumors that slipped like smoke from one house to the next told of girls who trembled and wailed, of visions unseen, of names whispered that no one dared to repeat aloud. The night grew deeper, and with it, unease. A dog barked, sharp and startled, somewhere at the edge of the village. Its sound cut through the silence like a blade. The barking stopped too quickly, leaving behind a hush that felt wrong, unnatural, as if the night itself was holding its breath. In one small house near the meeting house, Abigail Williams sat near a dying fire. The girl was no older than 11, yet her eyes wide, fever bright, seemed to belong to someone far older, or perhaps far more troubled. Beside her, Betty Paris, younger still, whimpered as though caught in a dream she could not escape. There, hands twitched, their small bodies shuddered, and their lips moved in whispers too faint to be understood. Reverend Samuel Paris, Betty's father, watched them with a mixture of dread and calculation. The candlelight painted sharp lines upon his face, deepening the furrows in his brow. To him, what he saw was no simple sickness. It was something darker, something he feared would shake not only his household, but his standing in the rigid, watchful eyes of Salem. He knelt beside the girls, his shadow stretching long across the floorboards. "Speak," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What do you see?" The girls' eyes darted to the corners of the room, as though shapes moved there that no one else could see. Abigail's lips parted, but the word that slipped forth was no. Word at all only a trembling sound, a half-scream swallowed by the crackle of the fire. Outside, the wind moaned softly against the walls. A branch scraped against the window pane, slow and steady, like fingers tapping for entry. The sound seemed to echo inside Abigail's restless gaze. And in that moment, Salem began to turn dark. It was not sudden, not like thunder striking or lightning, splitting the sky. It was a slow turning, quiet as frost gathering on glass. But from that night onward, fear would spread through the village like fire, hidden in dry grass, silent at first. Then unstoppable the whispers had begun, and as the embers of the hearth dimmed to red, the night itself seemed to lean in, listening, carrying those whispers across frozen ground, into the hearts of Salem's people. The village of Salem stood as though caught between two worlds. The ancient forest that whispered of shadows, and the open fields that promised survival but demanded toil. Snow still clung stubbornly to the ground, though the days had grown longer. In the mornings, the frost glittered like scattered shards of glass, and the air was heavy with the sharp scent of pine. It was into this world that the strange unease continued to spread subtle, creeping and heavy as mist rising from the marshes. Inside the parsonage, Reverend Samuel Parris had begun to notice the toll on his household. His daughter, young Betty, moved about the rooms as though chased by unseen winds. At times, she would fall silent for hours, her eyes fixed on some empty corner, as though she were staring at things no one else could see. At other times, her voice would break into sudden cries, shrill as ravens, echoing against the timber walls. And beside her, Abigail Williams's niece fed the flames of suspicion with her restless imagination. The candlelight in their rooms often flickered strangely when they prayed. Or perhaps it only seemed so, for the mind, once captured by fear, begins to find evidence everywhere. The sound of wood settling at night became footsteps. The sigh of the wind became whispers. And when silence fell, it was not peace they felt, but the heavy weighting of something unseen. The people of Salem were already primed for fear. The wilderness surrounding them was vast and untamed, a place where the howl of wolves carried across the frozen hills, and where rumors of native attacks still lingered in every uneasy glance. The colony itself was only decades old, still raw, still uncertain, still feeling as though survival depended on absolute order. And so when the whispers of witchcraft began to curl their way through the village, they found a place ready to receive them by firelight. Mothers hushed their children with warnings not to wander into the woods. Fathers gathered in low voices, speaking of scripture, of the devil's snares, of the signs of possession. And the ministers, with solemn eyes, reminded their flocks that Satan walked as a roaring lion, seeking whom he might devour. And so, each cough in the night, each startled cry, each faint shadow became suspect. What had once been explained as sickness or simple restlessness was now marked as evidence of a darker hand. Betty's strange fits, Abigail's fevered words, the trembling of the other young girls in the village, these became sparks, glowing faintly in the darkness, waiting for a breath of wind to catch and spread. The snow began to melt, though slowly. The earth beneath revealed itself in patches of brown, soft and wet with thawing frost. But though the world hinted at spring, the air remained cold, and so too did the hearts of the villagers, who carried suspicion as though it were an ember, pressed into their palms. They could not drop it, could not let it go dot, and in the evenings, when the houses stood lit by single flames, one could almost imagine the shadows listening. Neighbors grew wary of one another. A glance held too long. A silence that seemed unusual. A word half spoken. All became fodder for the growing fear. Tituba, the enslaved woman in Paris's household, moved quietly through these days, though whispers followed her as well. She carried with her stories from Barbados, tales of spirits, and omens of dreams that spoke and fires that answered. To the young girls, her stories were curiosities, told in secret, thrilling against the stern walls of Puritan severity. But in a village now trembling on the edge of hysteria, those same stories turned to accusations. A laugh in the wrong place, a word misunderstood, and suddenly the line between story and sin blurred until no one could tell the difference. The trials of the mind began long before the trials of the court. In kitchens and by hearths, people whispered of goats that gave no milk, of bread that burned black, of children struck with sudden sickness. And always the thought returned. Perhaps it was no accident. Perhaps it was witchcraft. Perhaps the devil's servants walked among them, cloaked not in shadow, but in the faces of neighbors, friends. Even family died. And so Salem, beneath its cold sky and thinning snow, began to hold its breath. The fire had not yet burst into full flame, but the smoke was curling upward, and the first sparks glowed faintly in the eyes of its people. The night seemed deeper, the silence heavier, and in that silence a question lingered, one that none dared speak aloud. If witches truly walked among them, who would be next to fall under their shadow? And so the days of Salem stretched on, each hour heavy with a silence that was rarely broken, except by the faint toll of the church bell or the whisper of voices too afraid to rise above a murmur. The wooden homes, their roofs bent beneath the weight of frost, seemed to lean toward one another, as though sharing the burden of secrets that had taken root in their walls. Inside the parsonage, where the hearth glowed faintly against the draught, Reverend Paris bent over his papers. Ink pooled across the page, the candlelight trembling as though nervous in his hand. His daughter still lingered in her strange, tormented fits. Abigail, his niece, lingered close by, her sharp eyes quick, to catch every shift in his mood, every sigh of worry that escaped his lips. It was within this fragile chamber, amidst the prayers and the endless hush, that fear truly began to gather strength. Beyond those walls, in homes where straw crackled underfoot and shutters rattled against the night wind, the people of Salem prayed for answers. Some clutched their Bibles tighter, their fingers trembling as they traced the familiar words. Others sought comfort in whispers, their voices low and trembling. Had the devil come to Salem? And as the question lingered, it grew like ivy in the mind. It crept into the silence of the fields, into the shadows of the forests where the trees leaned tall and black against the winter sky. It grew in the marketplace, where eyes began to meet with hesitation, suspicion flashing like sparks in the cold. Neighbors who once shared bread and laughter now glanced over their shoulders, measuring the length of each breath, the weight of each silence. The snow outside softened footsteps, but inside the meeting house, each step rang clear, echoing against the timber walls. It was here that words began to twist into accusations, here that the fear found a tongue. At first, it was no more than a suggestion, a murmured name, and a breath of doubt. But words are powerful things. Once spoken, they cannot be gathered back, and in Salem, they took root in the minds of all who heard them. The fire of suspicion spread from house to house, its embers carried on the chill air. The candlelight seemed dimmer at night, though the flames burned as before. The sound of a child's cry in the distance felt sharper, edged with unease. And all the while, the women accused some frail with age, some strong with years of labor stood, bewildered, their voices trembling as they swore their innocence. Yet innocence, once questioned, never returns unbroken. The night stretched long, and Salem seemed caught between waking and dreaming. A hush clung to the streets, though within each home, hearts beat quickly, afraid to be heard. For it was no longer the snow or the hunger that haunted them, but something darker, a shadow that walked without form. And so the season deepened, each day sliding into the next, each night carrying its whispers. The fire had been lit, though. None could see how far its flames would spread. The silence of Salem was no longer the silence of winter. It was a silence that listened, that leaned close, that clung to the edges of every conversation. Neighbors no longer spoke freely at their thresholds. Even the sound of chopping wood in the yard seemed guarded, cautious, as though each swing of the axe might reveal something more than labor. The fields lay barren, their furrows frozen stiff, and the animals in their pens stirred uneasily. The people who had once gathered with warmth around fires now huddled with suspicion, measuring every glance, every tone of voice. It was not hunger that gnawed at them most. It was doubt. Doubt of their neighbors. Doubt of themselves. Doubt of the safety of their souls. The first names had already been whispered. Names carried on lips that trembled but did not falter. To speak a name was to divert the shadow from one's own hearth, to place the mark of suspicion upon another. Door. And once a name was spoken, it grew heavy. Heavy in the ears of those who heard it. Heavy in the hearts of those who wondered if it could be true. Sarah Good, her name was among the first. Poor and ragged, with her clothes threadbare and her voice often sharp, she had been long judged by the town. To accuse her was almost easy. Her poverty made her vulnerable. Her misfortune made her suspect. Then came Sarah Osborne, frail with illness, her body bent with years of weakness. She had not attended the meeting house in many months, and her absence had been noticed. Now her absence was explained not by frailty, but by whispers of sin and Tituba, the enslaved woman who lived in Reverend Parris's own household, was named as well. Her skin, her stories, her strangeness set her apart. When the girls spoke of her, they spoke with a trembling certainty, claiming she had whispered spells, that she had given them visions. Whether truth or invention, her name, too, was carried. Into the meeting house. The meeting house itself became the center of the storm. Its wooden benches, worn smooth by years of use, now held the weight of accusations. The pulpit, from which prayers once flowed, now echoed with darker words. Testimonies were spoken, fears confessed, and each sentence left behind a residue of unease. The air inside seemed thick, heavy with the mingling of prayer and accusation. The children of Salem, who once played among the snowy drifts, now imitated the strange fits they had witnessed. Their cries, their writhing, their vacant stares spread from one to another, until it was no longer possible to tell who truly suffered and who merely followed. Their innocence gave power to their words, for who would doubt the testimony of a child? And so the adults listened, their brows furrowed, their hearts troubled, and their tongues repeating the words they heard. Day after day, the names grew. The whispers became declarations. The private suspicions became public accusations. And Salem, small as it was, became a place divided against itself. Families who once broke bread together now sat on opposite sides of the meeting house. Hands that once clasped in prayer now pointed across the room dotted night. When the fires dimmed and the winds pressed against the walls, the people of Salem lay awake. They listened for sounds in the dark, the creak of a floorboard, the whisper of a voice not their own. Dreams, once filled with the simple burdens of labor and harvest, now grew heavy with visions of fire, of shadows, of figures standing at the foot of their beds. Sleep, when it came, was no refuge that the jail in Salem began to fill. Its walls, cold and damp, became crowded with those whose names had been spoken too often. Shackled, weary, bewildered, they whispered their prayers in the darkness, their voices overlapping in a low murmur that rose like smoke through the cracks of the wooden beams. Outside, the townsfolk walked past the barred windows, averting their eyes, afraid to meet the gaze of those within. The snow melted slowly, but the chill in the air did not lift. For Salem was no longer merely a town bound by the seasons. It was a town bound by fear. And fear, once planted, does not fade with the thaw. It grows, it spreads, it takes root in the soil of the heart. And soon no field, no hearth, and no soul is free of it. And so the season pressed on. The fire had been kindled, and though its flames were not yet seen, the smoke of it was already curling through every home, every street, and every dream. The snow began to loosen its grip on the fields, though the air still carried the weight of winter. In Salem village, small signs of thaw brought no comfort, for the cold that clung to people's hearts was deeper than the frost on the ground. The whispers that had first drifted like uncertain winds inside Reverend Parris's household had now taken on a more defined shape, like a spark glowing within dry timber. It was faint, fragile, but it promised fire. Young Abigail, with her sharp eyes and quick tongue, found that the attention stirred by her strange outbursts was intoxicating. She would sit by the hearth, speaking of shadows that pressed on her chest, of figures with claws and whispers in her dreams. Sometimes she trembled so fiercely that even hardened men leaned closer, wondering if they too could feel the chill she described. The village, long weighed down by its hunger for meaning, began to believe that it was not just Abigail and little Betty anymore. Other girls, Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, and a few more, soon echoed the same cries. They twisted on the floor, shrieking as though unseen hands pinched them. They claimed spirits spoke through the walls, accusing, mocking, and tempting them to deeds unspeakable. Each fit was a performance of fear, but to those who watched, it carried the undeniable shape of something real. Parents clutched their children tighter at night, terrified of the invisible dot. And when the girls began to name names, the spark finally caught. At first, it was Tituba, the enslaved woman in Reverend Parris's household. She was different, her skin darker, her stories from islands far away. The village already looked at her as if she belonged to another world. So when Abigail pointed her finger and cried that Tituba's spirit tormented her, the crowd murmured in agreement. Then, before the doubt could settle, other names followed. Sarah Good, the ragged beggar who mumbled prayers under her breath, and Sarah Osborne, the woman who had quarreled with the Putnams over land and inheritance. The accusations fell like embers, each landing on dry straw. And soon, the fire spread dot in the small meeting house. Villagers gathered, pressed shoulder to shoulder, their breaths misting the cold air. Reverend Parris thundered from the pulpit that the devil himself had set his foot in Salem. His words carried across the wooden beams like sparks leaping from a flame. The accused were dragged before the people, trembling as the children wailed and screamed at their presence. Sarah Good swore she was innocent, though her thin, cracked voice carried little weight. Sarah Osborne struggled even to stand, her body frail, and her mind often distant. And Tituba, poor Tituba, cornered and beaten by fear, at last spoke. Words that sealed the fate of Salem. Yes, she confessed, her voice broken. The devil came to me. He asked me to serve him. He showed me his book, and many names were written there. Witches walk among us. A gasp spread through the room like a sudden gust of wind. For the people, this was no longer mere suspicion. This was proof. If Tituba, under God's eye, admitted to such horrors, then surely the devil's hand was heavy on Salem. And if witches walked among them, how many more might yet be hidden, smiling in daylight, whispering in darkness? The first spark had become a flame, and it would not be easily smothered. Fear works like hunger. It grows when fed. The girls discovered that each fit, each scream, each finger pointed gave them power. And power was rare in Salem, especially for the young, for the poor, for the voiceless. They became the instruments of God, the chosen witnesses, the ones who could see what others could not. And the adults, hardened men who tilled the soil and led in prayer, began to bow to. The voices of children died soon. Whispers turned into shouts. Neighbors who once shared bread now exchanged wary glances across the fields. Old grudges stirred like ashes kicked by the wind. A boundary dispute could suddenly transform into an accusation of witchcraft. A misfired crop, a sick cow, a child falling ill, all became signs of the devil's touch. Suspicion became the currency of the village, and none could afford to be without it. And so, Salem village began to fracture. Friendships that had endured harsh winters crumbled under the weight of doubt. Families locked their doors earlier, praying louder, yet still listening for the creak of footsteps on the floor, the rustle of unseen garments in the dark. The town, once bound by its fragile unity, now felt the fire licking at its edges. The first spark had spread, and Salem would never be the same again. The snow that had once muffled Salem's silence began to soften as February pushed toward March. Yet the hush did not lift, for something deeper had taken root in the air. In the small parsonage where Reverend Samuel Parris lived, the shadows seemed to grow longer. His young daughter Betty still lay curled upon her bed, prone to fits of shaking and sudden cries. Beside her, the niece he had taken in, Abigail. Williams grew restless, her eyes darting with a fever that no herb or prayer seemed to calm. Neighbors whispered as they came and went from the Paris home. Some claimed the girls' bodies twisted in ways unnatural, their limbs bent like reeds in a storm, their voices shrieking as though unseen hands had seized their throats. Others swore they saw nothing unusual, only children feigning sickness, to avoid chores or punishment. Yet in a village so burdened by fear, even a small cry carried the weight of thunder. It was in this climate that the first spark caught. One by one, others began to echo the strange fits. Ann Putnam Jr., the 12-year-old, daughter of one of Salem's most influential families, began to tremble. Mercy Lewis, a servant, fell into convulsions. Soon, more young girls joined the chorus of cries, as if the sickness spread not through flesh, but through suggestion and dread. At night, the Paris household became a theater of terror. The fire crackled in the hearth, but its warmth could not comfort. The girls whimpered of spirits that pressed upon their chests, of specters that pinched and clawed, of a black figure who offered promises in return for loyalty. Their words were soft enough to be dismissed at first, but the persistence of their cries forced even the skeptical to wonder. The Reverend himself, stern and watchful, grew consumed by the thought that his own house might be the cradle of Satan's assault. His sermons grew darker, his prayers longer. In his eyes, every creak of timber and every gust of wind carried a message. Salem, he warned, was under siege. As the cries of the children deepened, so too did the search for a cause. Who had done this? Who had opened the door to the devil? The question slithered through the town like smoke. In a place already strained by feuds, by land disputes, by grudges old and new, suspicion was an ember waiting for breath. The breath came when the girls, pressed by elders, spoke names. At first hesitantly, then with mounting confidence, they pointed fingers. The accused were not the wealthy nor the powerful, but those easiest to blame. Those who walked the margins of Salem's life. Sarah Good, a poor beggar woman known for her muttering and for the tatters she wore. Sarah Osborne, who seldom attended church and had quarreled with neighbors. And Tituba, the enslaved woman in Reverend Parris's household, whose tales of spirits and distant lands had long fascinated the children. The village trembled at these accusations. A beggar, a recluse, and a servant, 3 women with little power to defend themselves, became the first marked as agents of darkness. The spark had leapt into flame. When they were brought before the magistrates in early March, the meeting house swelled with onlookers. The girls convulsed at the sight of the accused, shrieking as though invisible claws raked their skin. The room echoed with cries, and even those who doubted began to feel unease. Could such terror be feigned? Could children weave such a tale with such persistence? Sarah Good pleaded innocence, her voice hoarse with desperation. Sarah Osborne, frail and sickly, murmured her denial, but it was Tidaba's words that truly fed the fire. Perhaps frightened by the weight upon her, perhaps broken by the relentless questioning, she confessed. She told of a tall man in black who urged her to sign his book, of strange creatures, of witches who walked among them unseen. Gasps filled the hall. The whispers became shouts. If there were witches in Salem, then who else might they be? Tidaba's. Confession, however, shaped by fear, cracked open a door that could not be shut. From her lips spilled the suggestion of a conspiracy far greater than 3 women. There were more, she said, many more. Their faces unknown, their hands hidden, their oaths sworn to darkness. That night, as families huddled in their homes, candles burned low, and the woods outside seemed alive with menace. Mothers clutched children close. Fathers checked their muskets twice. No one knew who might be next. The first spark had ignited, and Salem would never again be the same dot. The murmur of fear had now become a roar. Salem, once only bruised by suspicion, was now burning with it. Every whisper in the marketplace, every prayer in the meeting house, every creak of a shutter in the night was taken as a sign that witchcraft walked among them. The spark that began in the parsonage had spilled into the streets, igniting the hearts of neighbors against neighbors. Fingers pointed more quickly now. A woman who kept to herself was suddenly guilty. A man whose cow had died in the winter was surely cursed by the touch of a witch. If a child fell ill, it was no longer an act of fate. It was proof of Satan's servants at work. And so the flames spread. The ministers thundered from the pulpit that vigilance was a holy duty. The magistrates, though uneasy, found themselves swept into a storm they could not control. Each testimony carried weight, no matter how fragile. Each cry from the afflicted girls echoed like scripture in the ears of the town. One by one, more names were spoken. Sarah Good, poor and ragged, accused of muttering curses under her breath. Martha Corey, once respected, condemned for doubting. The girls, Rebecca Nurse, frail and devout, pulled into the web despite her piety. With each accusation, the town's soul twisted further. For if even the righteous could be witches, then who was safe? Jails filled, shackles clinked. Families wept as loved ones were dragged away, protesting their innocence. The snow of winter gave way to the rains of spring, but Salem's air grew no lighter. Instead, it thickened with dread. The flames reached into every home, even into the minds of children, who now dreamed of witches in the woods and devils in the dark. Merchants feared to sell to the accused. Friends feared to greet one another. Trust dissolved, leaving only suspicion in its place. By summer, Salem was no longer a village of prayer and harvest. It had become a furnace, fueled by fear, in which reputations, friendships, and lives were consumed. And though no fire was seen in the sky, all could feel its heat upon their skin, and all knew the blaze was far from finished. The fire no longer hid in whispers, it stood in the open, burning through the very heart of Salem. As spring deepened, the town was consumed by trials that seemed less about truth and more about survival. The meeting house, once a place of worship, became a courtroom. Its wooden benches groaned under the weight of neighbors come to testify against one another. Children peered through cracks in the walls, wide-eyed at the spectacle, while elders clutched their Bibles, muttering prayers between gasps. The afflicted girls fell into fits before the magistrates, crying out that specters tormented them. They pointed, they shrieked, they collapsed. Their bodies twisted as though unseen hands pulled their limbs. To the onlookers, it was proof undeniable. The devil himself had taken root in their village, and so the court of Oyer and Terminer was formed, a name that meant to hear and to determine. It was here that the fates of men and women would be sealed, not by evidence, but by fear and performance. Giles Corey, old and stubborn, stood with defiance, refusing to utter a plea. His silence became louder than any confession, a protest carved into history. Others wept, begging for mercy, while some confessed falsely, hoping to save their necks from the rope. But confession did not always mean salvation. It meant a life forever scarred, a soul branded with shame. The gallows rose on Gallows Hill, stark against the summer sky. It stood as both warning and spectacle, where crowds gathered not for justice, but for a grim theater. Each rope that swung carried not only a body, but the weight of the town's conscience. Though few admitted it aloud, Rebecca Nurse walked with dignity to her death, her frail frame steady, and her voice calm in prayer. Sarah cursed them, proud with her final breath, declaring that God would judge them all. Martha Corey whispered forgiveness. And 20 souls, innocent and accused, met their end beneath the noose or the pressing stone. The air of Salem was forever changed, carrying the echo of prayers cut short, the creak of ropes, and the silence of lives extinguished. But even as bodies fell, the fire did not die. It smoldered in the hearts of the living, in the whispers of children, in the restless dreams of those who remained. For Salem had set something in motion that could not be easily undone. The summer sun rose high over Salem, yet its warmth could not touch the cold that had settled in the hearts of the villagers. The court convened once more, this time with more names, more accusations, and a heavier air of dread. Inside the meeting house, wooden benches groaned under the weight of those who had come to testify, and the walls themselves seemed to absorb every whisper of fear, every shiver of suspicion. The magistrates, faces grim and eyes sharp, presided. With the weight of authority, yet even they were not immune to the pressure that filled the room. Every cry of a child, every contortion of a girl's body, seemed to carry the voice of the devil himself. And so, the court listened, not to truth, but to fear made manifest. One by one, accused individuals were called forward. Sarah Good, ragged and trembling, declared her innocence again and again. The magistrates nodded, noting her defiance, yet their eyes betrayed little sympathy. Sarah Osborne, frail and sickly, attempted to explain herself, but even her frailty became evidence in their eyes. And Tituba, the enslaved woman, now weary and frightened, repeated the confession that had set this fire alight. The girls' fits grew more dramatic with each session, their cries echoing against the beams. Specters appeared in their words, some as animals, some as shadows. They accused those long respected in the village, shaking the foundations of Salem's sense of order. Neighbors began to turn on each other. Grudges once hidden beneath polite greetings now rose openly. Land disputes, petty arguments, and old quarrels were reframed as evidence of dark dealings. The fire of accusation was no longer contained. It spread through homes and hearts, consuming trust and patience alike. And then the gallows awaited. On Gallows Hill, the platform was set, ropes coiled, trapdoors tested. Families watched, some weeping, others stiffened by fear. Every life that ended there was a mirror reflecting the town's collective conscience, a mixture of guilt, suspicion, and sorrow. Rebecca Nurse, fragile yet unwavering, walked calmly to her death, praying softly under her breath. Sarah Good cursed those who watched with a final defiant cry. Martha Corey whispered forgiveness, even as her own fate was sealed. Giles Corey, steadfast, refused to speak. Stone after stone was laid upon him, each press of weight an attempt to crush his spirit, yet he endured, uttering only the words, "More weight," until his last breath. The 20 souls, innocent, guilty, accused, and accused falsely, all met the same merciless end. Their prayers and cries mingled with the wind, rising above the town, settling in the forests, the fields, the frozen rivers. Even as the hanging ceased, the memory of their lives and deaths haunted every doorstep, every whispered conversation, and every nighttime shadow. Salem itself had been transformed. The fire that began with whispered accusations had become a consuming blaze, leaving behind ashes of trust and the lingering smoke of fear. It was not just the 20 souls who were lost. It was the innocence of the village, the certainty of community, and the quiet comfort of ordinary life. The night descended slowly, the stars distant and cold above the village. Families huddled close, some praying for protection, some silently questioning their own hearts. The wind carried the echoes of footsteps, of whispered confessions, of words that would never be forgotten. Salem had been scarred, and even as the sun rose again, the shadow of those dark months remained, heavy and unmoving. And yet, in that shadow, the story was far from finished. For every fear, every accusation, every sorrow carried with it the lessons and warnings that would echo in the hearts of those who remained. The fire had awakened, and though it had burned, its whispers would continue to be felt, shaping dreams, shaping nights, and shaping the stories told around fires for generations to come. The season closed not with resolution, but with reflection, a quiet pause in which the village held its breath, listening for the echoes of Salem, for the whispers in the night that would never fully fade. As the night settles over Salem, the whispers of the past linger softly in every shadow. May these tales drift gently into your dreams, and when you awake, remember the echoes of history that shaped the village. If you enjoyed this journey, consider liking this video, sharing it with someone who loves quiet, haunting tales, and subscribing to follow every whisper in the night. Until next time, rest well and let the stories of Salem guide your sleep.